Under the harsh hum of a discount store, a broke single dad buys his last pack of diapers with a 10 that feels like goodbye, until a stranger in a tailored coat quietly orders every pack in the building. Pride flares, a baby fusses, and a sentence. No child should go without what they need, unlocks a door neither man knew was there. What follows isn't charity, it's a collision of two lives on opposite ends of the city, one drowning in bills, the other in silence. A custody fight, a courtroom, a seizure, a map of mercy, and the start of an unexpected family. In the dim fluorescent light of the discount store, Matthew stood clutching a small pack of diapers like it was the last lifeline he had. His palms were sweaty, his throat dry, and his heart beat too loudly for such a quiet aisle. He shifted the weight of his daughter on his hip. She was barely a year old, her tiny fist tangled in his shirt, and he couldn't stop thinking about the fact that this single pack of diapers was about to cost him his very last dollar, literally the last. Rent was overdue, the refrigerator was nearly empty, and his gas tank sat just above empty. But diapers were non-negotiable. He couldn't let his daughter go without. The cashier gave him the kind of distracted smile that said she had scanned 1,000 packs of diapers before. "That'll be $9.47, she said. Matthew pulled a wrinkled $10 bill from his pocket. It was soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, like it knew this was its last journey. His hand shook as he handed it over, and when she dropped the few cents of change into his palm, he stared at it as if it might magically multiply. He stuffed it into his pocket anyway, his pride crumbling around him. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. A man's voice, smooth and low, carried a question that didn't sound like small talk. It sounded deliberate. "Is that the last one they had?" Matthew turned slightly. Behind him stood a man who looked entirely out of place in a discount store. Immaculate tailored coat, polished shoes that had never touched mud, and a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than Matthew's yearly rent. His eyes were sharp, observant, but not unkind. The cashier looked confused. "We've got more in stock. Want me to grab some?" The stranger shook his head and gestured toward Matthew's bag. "No, I'll take them all, every pack you've got in the store." The words hit like a foreign language. Matthew blinked, unsure he'd heard right. The cashier blinked too, then laughed nervously. "All of them?" "All of them," the man repeated calmly. "Every size, every brand. Box them up, deliver them if you have to." Matthew's ears burned. His pride flared, his chest tightening. He wanted to say no, to snap back that he didn't need charity, that this was his problem to bear. But his daughter squirmed in his arms, fussing softly, reminding him of what was at stake. The man's gaze flicked to her, just for a second. But something softened in his face. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. Instead, he said quietly, almost like it was meant for Matthew alone, "No child should ever go without what they need." And that was the moment Matthew's life began to change. What followed that moment was not just the handing over of diapers, not just a transaction between a broke single father and a wealthy stranger. It was the beginning of a story of two worlds colliding, of a man with nothing left to give but love for his child, and another man with everything but love in his life. One desperate for survival, the other drowning in loneliness despite his fortune. Their paths should never have crossed, but fate has a way of arranging unlikely encounters that alter the entire trajectory of lives. What Matthew didn't know was that the man behind him wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the city's most powerful CEOs. And what the CEO didn't know was that by stepping forward in that small moment of quiet compassion, he wasn't just buying diapers. He was buying his way into a story of redemption, love, and unexpected family. And that story unfolded in ways neither of them could have predicted. Under the harsh fluorescent glow of the discount store, Matthew steadied his daughter against his chest and told himself to breathe. The pack of diapers in his hand felt heavier than it should have, as if every sleepless night, every overdue bill, every apology he'd mumbled to the landlord had been shrink-wrapped inside it. His little girl, Nora, tucked her face into the soft curve of his shoulder, her breath warm and damp against his collar, and his palm rose and fell on her back in slow circles because that was the one motion he could afford. Endless, costless, and somehow still not enough. The cashier's scanner chirped. 947, she said, bored, the syllables worn down from repetition. He fished the crumpled 10 from his pocket, the paper limp and softened from too much folding and unfolding, like cloth someone couldn't bear to throw away. He placed it on the counter and felt that old sting crawl up the back of his throat, the kind he'd learned to swallow a long time ago, when pride and hunger had started measuring their days against each other. Change is 53. The coins slid into his palm. He stared at them longer than necessary, knowing their math didn't matter anymore. Rent wasn't a number tonight. Rent was a shadow. Gas was not a gauge. It was a rumor. But diapers were the law. You could talk your way around everything else. Not this. Behind him, a voice said, "Is that the last pack they have?" He turned half an inch, as far as the habit of caution allowed. The man who'd spoken didn't look like he belonged under fluorescent lights. His coat hung just right. His shoes reflected aisles he had probably never walked. A watch sat on his wrist the way a crown sits on a head. Natural, inevitable. He wasn't old, but he had the posture of someone who hadn't had to hurry for years. The cashier, thrown off script, blinked at him. "We've got more in back," she said. "Want me to grab a few?" The man's eyes flicked from the register to the pack in Matthew's hand, then to Nora's small fist knotted in her father's shirt. "No," he said. "I'll take them all, every pack in the store." The cashier let out an involuntary laugh and then swallowed it. "All?" "All," he repeated, the syllable balanced and certain. "Every size, every brand. Box them. Deliver them if you have to." Heat slicked up the back of Matthew's neck. The first words that pushed against his teeth were angry ones, the kind that rose when a man's dignity got nudged. He wanted to say he didn't need handouts. He wanted to say he could handle his life. He wanted to say a lot of things people who had never stood inside his skin liked to hear. But Nora squirmed and whined, and the movement tugged the collar of his T-shirt down far enough to expose the little rash creeping over her shoulder, the one he'd been managing with careful baths and second-hand advice. He shut his mouth and tasted the copper of swallowed pride. The stranger's expression didn't change. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't soft. He simply looked for a second longer than most people would look. "No child," he said quietly, "should go without what they need." It was a sentence worn smooth by use. It sounded like he'd told it to himself more than to other people. It clicked into something inside Matthew, like a key turning. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. He shifted Nora higher, her cheek to his jaw, and stepped away to make room while the cashier called for help, and the intercom popped and cracked and carried the improbable order to the stockroom. When he reached the automatic doors, cold night air slid under his coat. He hadn't realized how warm the store was until he felt the temperature change. The parking lot lights smeared in the drizzle like smudged pencil. The stranger followed, not too close, not claiming anything beyond the few feet of wet concrete his expensive shoes touched. "Can I at least help you to your car?" he asked. "I walked," Matthew said. It sounded sharper than he meant. A nod, no flinch. "Then let me call you a ride." "My place is 4 blocks, Matthew said. "Save your money." The man's gaze settled on the old stroller bungeed to the bottom of an ancient grocery cart, chained to the cart corral by a dirty orange strap. He looked at the cheap plastic rain cover that cracked when you folded it, the scuffed wheels that dragged left no matter how you corrected them. He did not look at Matthew with pity. He looked at Nora. He crouched, not quite to her level, not quite that intimate, but lower, the way you adjust yourself to speak to a child, and not over her. "Hey," he said softly, "I'm Nick." The name slid in without effort. It didn't whistle with wealth. It didn't make demands. Nora peered at him with damp lashes and said, "Da." "Yeah," he murmured, like he was agreeing with her definition of the world. Might as well be. He stood and met Matthew's eyes. "I don't want to insult you," he said, "and I'm aware this will sound like one, but I'm going to say it anyway. I know a good car seat when I see one. That isn't one." It was good enough for the last kid that used it. Matthew shifted his grip on Nora, defensive without wanting to be. "I believe you," Nick said. "What's your name?" "Matthew." The man considered it like he was trying it on. "Okay, Matthew, give me 10 minutes. If you're still here when I come back, let me put a proper seat in whatever you're using to get around. I'll have them bring the diapers out. Then you never have to see me again if you don't want to." "I don't want to owe you." "You won't," he said, the answer unpremeditated and firm. "I'm not keeping score." 10 minutes later, a taxi pulled up. Behind it, a delivery van bearing the store's logo idled with its hazards on. A wide-eyed assistant manager hopped out with a clipboard that looked like it had never been asked to do something like this, and thrust it at Matthew for a signature. At the same time, a smaller car with dealership plates slid into the handicap slot, and a young guy in a branded jacket popped the trunk and lifted out a car seat as if he were carrying a ceremonial object. "What's this?" Matthew asked. "Seat," Nick said. "And don't worry, it's not top-of-the-line nonsense. It's safe, it's comfortable, and it won't expire before she's in kindergarten. They're going to install it for you so the straps fit. You'll know how to do it next time." Matthew looked at the seat, at the cargo of boxes being loaded into the delivery van, at the taxi. He felt something he couldn't name, panic maybe, but not the kind that came from scarcity, the kind that came from sudden abundance. He clutched Nora tighter. "Why?" he asked. It wasn't hostile. It was just the exact question. For the first time, the stranger's posture altered. Something old and private let its guard down an inch. "Because the first time my mother couldn't afford something basic," he said, "nobody helped. And the last time she couldn't afford something basic, nobody helped. And in between, people told her to try harder." Matthew's fingers loosened against Nora's back, not because everything was okay now, but because the shape of the man's voice felt familiar, like a road he'd walked in a parallel life. He nodded once. That was as much acceptance as he could manage. The young installer adjusted the straps, explained gently, demonstrated, and made sure Matthew's hands learned the motions. They loaded the taxi with 2 big boxes to get him through the night and the morning. The rest went into the van with the clipboard, the assistant manager, and the improbable mountain of generosity that had just been added to the inventory of a small life. At the curb, Nick looked like he wasn't sure if he should offer a handshake or not. He didn't. He said, "There's a number in the first box for delivery scheduling. You pick the times. Nothing shows up at your place unannounced. You don't have to sign for anything again." "You do this a lot?" Matthew asked. "No," he said, "never like this." The cab door closed, the world slid sideways, and taillights smeared in the rain. In the back seat, Nora fell asleep with her fist still tangled in his shirt. He rested his cheek on her hair and watched the city pass in streaks of sodium orange and window glow. He did not realize until the driver spoke that he had been smiling without meaning to. "Good guy," the driver said, nodding at the store shrinking in the rear view. Matthew thought about the man's watch and the way he crouched, about the easy authority and the sentence that had felt like a promise to himself as much as to anyone else. "I don't know," he said, but he was good tonight. The apartment he returned to was not worthy of the name. The hallway carpet harbored a history of spills. The elevator stalled between floors unless you knew exactly how to speak to it in the ancient language of button presses and sighs. Inside the unit, the heat groaned to warmth with the resigned effort of a machine that knew it would be asked for more than it was paid. He laid Nora down in the thrift store crib he'd sanded and repainted on the one day he'd had more time than money, and he stood there listening to her small breath even out into sleep. On the counter a paper lay face down, a rectangle of trouble he had refused to look at before the store run. He flipped it. The red stamp didn't apologize. The date in the corner came on like a siren. He let the paper rest and washed a bottle by hand because the dish rack rattled too loud when you used it. He sank into the one good chair, set his phone on his knee, and typed Nick Wealthy New York into the search bar, because curiosity has its own budget. He didn't have to scroll far. Nicholas Evans, CEO, Evans Meridian. He'd seen the name on headlines he never clicked. Long articles about mergers, short articles about a yacht he'd never see, a picture of a charity gala where people wore clothes that had never been near bleach, interviews where the man's jaw looked just like it had in the parking lot, set, intentional, aware of the camera and unwilling to smile just to satisfy it. He could have stopped there and moved on, shrugged at the information like weather. But something kept him on the page. A link sat halfway down the results with fewer shares and fewer comments. He tapped. It was old. It was a profile from a local paper upstate. The text was cramped against a black and white photograph of a kid standing in a garage next to a woman with a kind face. The headline was nothing like the ones on the business pages. It said, "The boy who fixed everything but couldn't fix what broke." He read about a house where a father left and a mother built a life out of 3 jobs and duct tape. He read about a kid who worked summers at a small machine shop, a kid who stayed late for no extra pay, who learned to listen for the sound a motor made when it was one turn away from failing. He read a quote from the boy, no longer a boy, who said, "I promised myself I would build something so big the wind couldn't knock it over. Turns out the wind lives inside you if you let it." Matthew set the phone face down on his knee and stared at the wall where paint blistered under an old leak. Nora stirred and sighed. He rose quietly, laid his hand on her back, and watched the rise and fall. The next morning brought the delivery at exactly the time he'd chosen, 3 knocks that sounded oddly polite on a door that had met fists. The boxes looked absurd in the small kitchen, a cartoon stack, too many diapers by any logic other than the strict math of infancy. He stacked them against the wall and laughed, because what else do you do when reality changes the size of your kitchen? He called the number, the one in the box. A woman picked up on the second ring. "Delivery coordination," she said. "This is Grace." He admitted, halting, that he didn't know how much to schedule, that he didn't want to take more than he needed, that he didn't want someone on the other end of the line keeping a tally. She didn't interrupt. When he ran out of words, she said, "We're not counting." He cleared his throat. "What do I owe you for any of this?" "Nothing," she said. "It's covered." "By who?" She laughed, a sound that had nothing snide in it. "You know the answer." Is this something you just do for people?" "No," she said, and the way she said it matched the way Nick had said it. "But it's something we're doing for you." "You always say we?" "Always," she said, and added softer, "especially when he doesn't." He scheduled what he dared and hung up. The day ate itself the way days with babies do, quiet emergencies, small miracles, tiny tasks that never made you feel like you'd done anything except be needed. Late morning brought a call from a number he didn't know. He let it go to voicemail and listened, wary. "Matthew," a voice said. It was smoother through the tiny speaker, more distant. "It's Nick. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I won't take your time. There's a fair downtown this afternoon, community health stuff, strollers, car seat checks, free pediatric consults, no pitches, just people who know things. If you want to go, I'll meet you there and disappear the second you look bored." He considered in silence. The tired part of him bristled at the idea of being shepherded. The part of him that had watched a stranger crouch near a baby understood he wasn't being herded anywhere. He was being offered a door. "Text me the time," he said when he called back, "and the address." The fare wasn't fancy. It set up on a basketball court under a freeway that had carved a shadow through the neighborhood 20 years earlier and never left. But the tables were clean, and the nurses smiled, and the doctor who listened to Nora's lungs and peeked at her rash did so with a gentleness that made Matthew blink faster than he wanted to. "She's healthy," the doctor said. "You're doing good." He didn't remember the last time someone had said those words to him, like they were describing an observable fact instead of offering it as a consolation prize. He found Nick standing near a folding table stacked with free thermometers and pamphlets nobody would ever read. The man had traded his coat for a dark sweater and looked almost like he belonged, if you squinted. When he saw Matthew, he didn't walk over like a head of anything. He walked over like a person. "How's the seat?" "Secure." He had the marks on the backs of his hands from tugging the strap into place to prove it. "I think a minor earthquake couldn't move it." "Good." Nick glanced down at Nora and then away, as if too much looking at her might betray something he kept careful. "There's a session on infant CPR in 10 minutes. You going?" "If you are," he said. They stood with a dozen other parents and watched a woman in scrubs kneel on a foam mat and show them how to put their fear in a drawer and do what a body needs when someone stops breathing. Matthew followed the motions with his hands in the air, half embarrassed until he looked around and saw other men doing the same thing. Tough hands that fixed trucks and carried drywall, making small, precise shapes in the air over nothing. "Thank you for coming," the woman in scrubs said when the session ended. "I always worry the people who need this most can't get here." "They're here," Nick said, not loud. On the walk back to the edge of the fair, Nick asked, "Where do you work?" "Warehouse," Matthew said. "Night shift when I can get it. Day shift if someone owes me a favor. A little bit of everything when someone quits." He didn't say that childcare made hours arbitrary, and money even more so. He didn't say that a job that couldn't tell him when he'd work couldn't tell him how he'd live. "You like it?" "I like waking up with the light still on," he said. "I like not expecting anything from anyone. I like getting through." Nick nodded once. "I have a friend who runs a distribution center. Smaller than the ones you're thinking of, but clean, predictable hours. Benefits that are actually benefits. If you want, I can call him. He owes me a favor." "I don't want to be a favor." "You wouldn't be," he said, his face unflinching. "You'd be a recommendation. He still has to want you. You still have to choose him." "What's the catch?" "You'd have to show up," Nick said, "on time every time, which I suspect you already do." The interview happened 2 weeks later because he took his time making the decision. He wasn't afraid. He was tired of moving across a chessboard he hadn't chosen. But when he stepped into the office with glass walls and a pot of decent coffee, and a human resources person who didn't look like she knew how to weaponize a spreadsheet, something steady began in him. He didn't mention Nick's name. He let the plant manager, a woman with ink on her forearms and calluses on her hands, ask about his experience, a little forklift, a little shipping, a lot of overtime that had bought him a breath, and then been interrupted by a pregnancy he hadn't planned but would never, for an instant, have undone. She asked about his schedule, his needs, his availability. He told the truth. He left the room feeling like he'd told the right person the right thing. He didn't get a call that day. He got one the next. "Can you start Monday?" the plant manager asked. 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then a training rotation for a month. Pay isn't glamorous, but it's steady. Insurance kicks in at 30 days. It isn't charity. "I know," he said, realizing he did. On Monday, he woke to his alarm and didn't hit snooze. He put Nora's bottle in the warmer, kissed the soft hair at the top of her head, and met the neighbor, Mrs. Ruiz, at the door with a gratitude that made his throat ache. Mrs. Ruiz had 3 grandchildren of her own and a husband with a bad knee and the kind of practical mercy that shows up without speeches. "Go," she said. "We'll be here." He showed up and learned a conveyor's moods. He learned which boxes lied and which told the truth about their weight. He learned the name of the man who had worked there 27 years without missing a day, and the name of the kid who'd moved here to avoid becoming his father. He learned he was good with the part of the line that everyone hated, the fussy portion where labels had to be placed just so, and one out-of-tolerance corner jammed the whole thing. He learned that his hands were steady even on days when his life wasn't. He went home tired in a way he trusted. He made dinner that didn't come from a microwave. He watched Nora discover a square of sunlight on the floor and try to catch it with both palms. He learned the math of bedtime. He learned that happiness sometimes shows up like a schedule. It would be a nice story if it ended there, a neat arc. A stranger pays a bill the universe had refused to send, and a man who needed a ladder finds one, But lives don't end in tidy scenes. They coil and tangle and test the knots you've tied. They bring your past back around a corner when you're finally walking straight. 3 months into the job, on a Tuesday that had nothing interesting on its calendar, a woman stood at the end of Matthew's hallway with a lawyer and a letter that looked too heavy to lift. He knew her name before they told him. He had whispered it into the dark when he wasn't sure whether forgiveness was a virtue or a habit he couldn't break. Kelsey. She had Nora's eyes and a reflex for escape. She had postpartum pain that had calcified into something else. She had left the baby 5 weeks in with a kiss on her forehead and a note that said, "I love you, but not this." He had believed both sentences and had built a life around accepting that they coexisted. Now she stood with a paper that used the word rights, like it was a rope someone could throw across a chasm and pull themselves wherever they wanted. The lawyer did most of the speaking. She did the looking, eyes darting past the crib, past the dishes drying on the rack, past the plastic bin of clothes that would fit in 6 months if everything went right. "We're filing for custody," the lawyer said. "At minimum, visitation." Matthew nodded once, as if he were being asked if he wanted a bag for his items. He said nothing. He took the paper, said, "Thank you, because a mouth in shock will use its oldest words," and closed the door gently so that the baby wouldn't wake. He sat on the floor in the hallway and let his back rest against the cool plaster and stared at the scuffed boots beside his doormat. When he could breathe, he called Mrs. Ruiz and asked if she could watch Nora for an hour. "Of course," she said, "and for all the hours after that if you need." He walked to the only place he knew he could think, the small park 2 blocks over, where a maple leaned like it had opinions. He stood under it and didn't pretend the ground wasn't tilting. After 10 minutes, he took his phone out and studied one contact he'd added, but never used. He had not asked for this number. He had not wanted the line between gratitude and dependency to blur. But Nick had sent it anyway with a sentence. "If you ever need to call me for something that matters." He didn't call, he texted, because somehow that made it smaller, even if it wasn't. "I need help," he wrote. Then he edited. He had never liked that phrase. "I need advice," he wrote instead. It felt honest. The phone rang 10 seconds later. "Tell me where you are," Nick said. "At the park bench? The maple, the side with the broken slat?" "I'm 3 minutes away," Nick said. "Stay put." He arrived in 4. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled and no tie. He took the paper and read. He read it again, slower, as if the words might confess something on the second pass that they'd hidden on the first. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." "She left," Matthew said, the sentence clumsy with the weight of that months behind it. "Now she wants to come back with a lawyer who calls her choices a pause and my survival a problem." Nick nodded. "Custody isn't a prize," he said. "It's a map judges draw when they don't know the terrain. We'll give them a better map." "We?" "I said what I meant," Nick said. "I know a lawyer who knows this courtroom like it's a childhood bedroom. She's not someone you hire for vengeance. She doesn't do that. She's someone you hire when you want a judge to remember children are not bullet points." "I can't afford her." "Yes, you can," Nick said. "Because I can. Because I asked you to call me for something that matters." "It feels wrong." "It would feel wrong if you were asking for a boat," Nick said. "You're asking for a chance to stand up properly on a floor that's tilting. That's different. Please don't mistake my loneliness for generosity, but when I say this helps me, I'm not lying." Matthew frowned. "How does paying for a lawyer help you?" Nick looked at him like someone looking in a mirror that made him a little braver. "Because I have money like air, so much I forget it's there, and sometimes I remember I grew up holding my breath. This is how I exhale." The lawyer's office had worn carpet and shelves that sagged with papers that mattered. Her name was Ellen Finn. She shook Matthew's hand in a way that made his stomach stop being a fist and turned to Nick and said, "You owe me 2 dinners and a donation I get to direct." "You always collect," Nick said. "Only because you always pay," she said. And then she set the paper on her desk and read it, the way a surgeon looks at a scan. "Okay," she said at last. "We're not burning down anyone's life. We're not making speeches on courthouse steps. We're going to organize a story that has facts where the other side offers adjectives. We're going to make the judge's job easy." She asked for calendars and pay stubs. She asked for schedules and texts. She asked for the names of the people who watched Nora and the name of the pediatrician and the names of the neighbors who had keys. She asked in a way that didn't pry. It simply collected. The hearing was set for a month out, time enough to rehearse the truth without gilding it. He didn't rehearse. He took care of his daughter. He showed up at 6, learned a little more of the line's moods, and came home with energy he portioned carefully, some for dinner, some for baths, some for the last page of a book he read to a child who didn't understand a word yet but understood a rhythm. When the day came, the courthouse smelled like paper and old coffee and worry. The hallway chairs were the same kind of chairs everywhere, but worse. He sat with Ellen Finn and watched people fill spaces with stories that could be bent or straightened, depending on where you stood. Kelsey arrived in a dress she wouldn't have chosen for herself if someone hadn't chosen this for her. Her lawyer, a man with a voice like a polished floor, smiled at the judge as if they'd gone to the same school. When it was their turn, Ellen stood like someone who'd done this so often she'd forgotten how to be overawed and never learned how to be bored. She didn't talk about abandonment. She talked about a man who had built systems and schedules and a child who had built trust in him. She didn't talk about mistakes. She talked about pain and how it behaves when it isn't treated. She did not point at Kelsey with her arguments. She pointed at Nora with her hands, her logic, her faith in everyday rituals. When Matthew spoke, his voice surprised him. It didn't crack. It didn't swagger. He told the judge about washing bottles and memorizing the color of diaper tabs for the right size, about adjusting a car seat strap until his hands hurt, about waking every 2 hours the first 6 weeks because a person that small was louder than the future. He told the judge he did not want to take anything from anyone but days, one by one, until his child was old enough to tell him what kind of person she wanted to be. Kelsey's lawyer cross-examined with questions that had sharp edges and no fingerprints. Matthew answered with sentences that didn't try to impress anyone. He did not protect Kelsey from the truth, but he didn't hit her with it either. He said what happened and let the room decide what to call it. Ellen didn't object much. She let silence do her work when it mattered. She asked the neighbor with the bad knee to testify, and he did. And the judge leaned forward for the first time as if this old man with a repaired tendon knew something the lawyers had forgotten. Maybe that love is always what happens after you're tired. When the judge spoke, her tone was the tone of a math teacher explaining a proof. She did not deliver a speech. She delivered a plan. Primary custody to the father. Structured visitation to the mother with conditions that weren't punishments, just stairs she could climb if she chose to. She said the words in steady sentences, and Matthew only understood them when Nora's name came last, tethered to the phrase best interests, the way it should have been all along. Outside in the corridor, breath released from lungs like air from a balloon twisted too tight. Kelsey stood very still. She looked at Matthew, and then at the lawyer beside him. She did not cry. She said, "I'm sorry," and he believed that she was, and then she left with a plan that wasn't his to map. Nick had been there, and not there the whole time, on a bench in the back with his coat folded over one arm, a presence strong enough to lean against if you needed it, and light enough to ignore if you didn't. When they walked out under a sky that finally remembered how to be blue, he fell into step without demanding a roll. "What now?" he asked. "I go home," Matthew said. "I make lunch. I put her down for a nap. I go to work tomorrow." Nick nodded. That could have been the end of it. He had written his check in grace and gotten nothing back but the quiet version of gratitude he understood. But life had decided they were not finished with each other. 2 weeks later, Matthew was called into the plant manager's office for the kind of meeting that usually means beginnings. Someone up the chain had noticed his section ran smoother than it used to. Someone had circled his name in the schedule with a pen that meant something. They wanted to move him from the line to the control desk. It came with a raise you could feel, but not see if you were on the outside of his life. It came with a title that would mean nothing to anyone else and everything to him. The manager said, "You'll have to learn the software. You'll have to teach yourself things there isn't time to teach. But from what I hear, you've been doing that since the day you walked in." He said yes and found the way. His brain had been waiting for this. It loved systems. It loved bottlenecks because bottlenecks told the truth about where things thinned. It loved the way small changes made big differences if you stacked them right. He came home and wrote numbers on envelopes and found that math could be a kindness. He paid the landlord on the first of the month and added a thank you on purpose. He put $100 in a savings account and did not expect it to be there a week later. It was. He bought Mrs. Ruiz flowers with a ribbon that matched her laugh. And then the world tested him the way it tests anyone who stands up. He was closing the warehouse one evening when a pallet went missing on paper, but not in space. The software showed it leaving the building. The cameras didn't. A supervisor who had smiled at him like an ally mentioned it to the wrong person in the right tone, and by morning, a rumor ran along the line with the dirty grace of gossip. By noon, Human Resources had requested a meeting. By 2, his hands were empty, and his pockets were checked politely by a man who didn't want to be doing his job. He didn't call Nick. He called the plant manager. "Give me the video from Doc C and the timestamp from the software," he said. "Give me the 7 minutes on either side. I'll show you where the ghost is." She did. He did. The barcode scanner on Doc C had been spitting out false positives for a week whenever the weather changed. The glitch had been logged last Tuesday with a ticket that was marked due next Thursday, because the vendor liked slow money. He showed her the pattern like a rhythm only someone who listened every day could hear. He walked her through the way. A pallet on the adjacent dock had been scanned twice when a new guy had leaned his elbow on the trigger, bored. He didn't defend his honor. He defended his competence. They were the same thing in a building like this. The manager swore softly and picked up the phone. The rumor didn't apologize. Rumors never do. But she stood in the middle of the floor and said, "We don't eat our own." And sometimes that's better than an apology. On his way out that night, the sky low with snow, he checked his phone. A single text from a number that almost never appeared. "You okay?" He typed, "Fine." He deleted it. He typed, "Figured something out I didn't want to have to figure out." He sent it. "You have time for dinner?" Came back. He did. He called Mrs. Ruiz. He walked to a place with cheap soup and a waiter who counted regulars as income. Nick arrived in a parka that made him look like a person who could shiver. He ordered coffee like he needed it, not like it was a prop. Matthew told the story without embellishment. Nick listened the way he read contracts. Eyes steady, attention without flattery. When Matthew finished, Nick said, "I'm glad you didn't call me." "Me too," Matthew said. "Not because I wouldn't have wanted to help," Nick added, "because you didn't need me." "I needed someone to witness it," Matthew said, "but I needed to solve it myself." Nick smiled, not the tight press of lips he wore in photographs, but the actual expression of a person whose face had been taught how to do it at home long before cameras asked it to. "Good," he said. The waiter refilled the coffee and pretended not to hear the way the words sounded like relief. Across the months, a pattern formed that neither of them named. On Sundays, if the weather allowed, Matthew walked with Nora to a farmer's market set out on a triangle of City Street. Nick sometimes met them there, carrying a tote bag like he always had, and liking that he now had a reason to fill it. He bought fruit he didn't know what to do with, and asked the sellers, and they told him exactly, and he went home and learned how to do the simple kitchen things money never hires out. Sometimes he bought flowers and handed them to the toddler, and she handed them back, mangled, and he placed them in a jar anyway. Sometimes he didn't buy anything at all and walked along the edges of a life that wasn't his and let it wash something out of him that work never could. He never went upstairs. He never stayed when Matthew hinted at the reality of nap time like a storm. He sent articles about toddler shoes and never asked if they were read. He sent a photo once of a pair of tiny sneakers at the office on a shelf that had never held anything that mattered before. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The first time Nora took 3 steps in a row without falling, it happened in the park under the maple that had witnessed Matthew's worst. She pushed off from his knee like a diver and wobbled toward the bench where Nick sat, as if she'd trained for this sprint all her life. She walked into the curve of his hand and then fell against it, and he caught her. His eyes did something a camera would not have known how to name. He looked at Matthew and said, "She's fast." "She's stubborn," Matthew said, laughing, "because you needed to call it something." They tried the little things that mean nothing and everything. They took a bus ride to the museum on a free day and didn't go into the exhibit because the steps outside occupied a child for an hour. They made pasta with sauce from a jar and called it cooking school. They learned the migration patterns of pigeons that only flew to the next lamppost. They watched other men with their kids and felt a kinship that ignored everything money could sort. The press found out because the press always does. It wasn't a scandal. It was a story you could wrap in a headline that made people click because it made them feel less helpless. Billionaire CEO sponsors local dad. The comments were nicer than usual, and then not, because people have more moods than seasons. Nick didn't respond because he never did. He'd learned early that attention wasn't currency you could spend twice. He did one thing that mattered instead. He called his assistant and told her to set aside a fund, quietly, without the firm's name on it, to help single parents with small emergencies that had big consequences. He called it Start with Dads, because mothers got more brochures. He asked for no gala. He asked for no photos. He asked for receipts from landlords and daycares and bus companies and paid them without writing an inspirational speech. He kept showing up. He kept leaving early enough to make sure he never wore out his welcome. He gave advice only when asked and never prefaced it with, "I know better." He said, "I don't know a surprising amount for a man who was paid to know." On a Wednesday in winter, a babysitter canceled sick an hour before Matthew's shift. Panic rose, quick and useless. He dialed 3 numbers, none of which could help. He texted Nick to ask if he knew anyone, not because he expected him to, but because Nick's phone had turned into a directory of solutions for a world that often promised none. "Can I come?" came back. "Not for you to watch her," Matthew typed, thumbs hard on the screen. "I can't put that on you." "No," Nick wrote, "my driver. I'll sit in the office lobby with her for 30 minutes until Mrs. Ruiz's niece arrives. I have nothing between 5 and 6 that can't be moved. If you trust me with a lobby, if you trust me with 30 minutes. Matthew pictured the lobby with its quiet leather and its art that meant something if you had time. He pictured Nora in that space like a dropped pearl. He pictured Nick's face leaning down to her with that careful expression he had when he remembered to have one. He said yes, and then he said, "Thank you." And then he said, "If her hand goes up like this, it means she wants the book with the dog." And he laughed alone in his kitchen because it was the first time in months he'd let someone step into the problem long enough for him to breathe. 30 minutes became 20 because the niece ran. Nick texted a photo from the lobby. Nora serious on a chair too big for her, a book upside down in her lap, his hand visible at the edge of the frame holding a finger she had claimed. No captions. None needed. Spring came with a new lease on an apartment 2 floors up and 3 degrees safer. It came with a playground with a swing that squeaked and a slide that shocked your elbows. It came with a promotion that added a few digits to a paycheck and knocked a few years off of fear. It came with a day that looked ordinary, right up until it didn't. At 4:12 p.m. on a Saturday, Nora stumbled on the sidewalk, cried, and then stopped mid-cry and went heavy in his arms. Panic is not a plan, but it can be a compass. He ran to the urgent care 3 blocks over with a child cradled in a hold that men still learn even when no one teaches it to them. The waiting room was full of coughs and bandaged fingers and the old patience of people who've learned that emergencies wait their turn. His voice lifted without asking permission. "She's breathing," he said too loud, "but she's not right." The nurse at the desk stood. The doctor in the hall stepped aside. He was ushered into a room with bright lights and clean hands. They took Nora with the efficiency of practiced kindness and tested sugars and pressures and reflexes. They spoke to each other in a language that remembered to translate for him every third sentence. He stood and did nothing, and learned that sometimes that is the job of love. You stand and do nothing and refuse to leave. It was a seizure, not the kind that takes a life and doesn't give it back, but the kind that steals 30 seconds and leaves you shaking. They called it febrile, used words like likely and common and watch. They handed him paper that said what to do if it happened again and pills that dissolved like worry under a tongue. He sat in the parking lot after. Nora wrapped around him, her breath slow and easy again, and shook in a way he hadn't allowed himself in any room where anyone could see. He didn't call Nick. He texted a single word, scared. Then he backspaced because he remembered he wasn't asking for rescue. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just saying the truth out loud to someone who wouldn't tell him not to feel it. Nick called anyway. He didn't say, "It'll be okay," because he had spent enough time with lawyers to know you don't promise outcomes you can't guarantee. He said, "I'm here," and let the silence do the part words can never do. When Matthew was ready, he told the story from the start to the parking lot. When he was done, Nick said, "Does she want ice cream?" It was an absurd question, and it saved him. They met at the corner store that smelled like freezers and old cardboard. They chose the cheap Pops. Nora woke up and carried hers like a scepter. They sat on the curb because fancy seats didn't make things easier, and cheap concrete always felt like home. They ate in the wind and watched the wrapper blow into the street, and both stood up at the same time to chase it, because small litter isn't a big deal, but sometimes you need to win a fight you can finish.